The star who died alone in a motel, the forgotten tragedy of Judy Garland. Before she died, she called her daughter. The words were incoherent, slurred, a haunting echo of a woman once adored by millions. Hours later, Judy Garland was found lifeless in a rented London bathroom, her final curtain call taking place not under stage lights, but behind a locked motel door. No manager, no press, no applause. Just silence. How did the little girl who sang "Over the Rainbow" end up alone and broken, a ghost of her former self? How did Hollywood's darling, the one who brought magic to millions, vanish into addiction, poverty, and mental torment while the world barely noticed? The answer is as complicated as it is disturbing. This is not simply a tale of a fallen star. This is a story about a system that devours its own, a studio that drugged a child to keep her thin and working, a string of exploitative relationships that blurred the lines between love and manipulation, and a woman constantly chasing a version of herself she could never quite reach. Judy Garland wasn't just a tragic icon, she was a cautionary tale. Her smile was part performance, part mask, and behind it was a woman clawing for affection in a world that profited from her pain. Today, her legacy is polished, her voice immortalized. But very few talk about what really happened in the final years of Judy Garland when the cameras stopped rolling and the lights dimmed. What really killed Judy Garland? Fame? Drugs? Or was it something darker, something Hollywood still doesn't want to talk about? She was born Frances Ethel Gum in 1922 in Grand Rapids, Minnesota, a child with a voice too big for her tiny frame. Long before she was Judy Garland, she was the youngest in a vaudeville trio, performing alongside her sisters to modest crowds. Even then, her stage presence was magnetic, undeniable. By the time she was 13, MGM had her under contract, and Hollywood had its next golden child. But the golden age of Hollywood was anything but golden behind the scenes. MGM molded Judy Garland like clay, reshaped her image, rewrote her name, and put her through one of the most brutal transformation regimes the studio system had ever imposed. She was told she was too short, too fat, too plain. They stuffed her with amphetamines to keep her awake for long shoots, then downers to help her sleep. By the age of 17, she was chemically dependent not recreationally, but as a matter of professional survival. Then came The Wizard of Oz in 1939. Judy's portrayal of Dorothy was nothing short of cinematic magic. Her rendition of Over the Rainbow became iconic overnight. But while the world was enchanted, Judy was living a different reality. On set, she was treated like a product, slapped when she laughed between takes, put on strict diets of chicken soup, coffee, and cigarettes. Her co-stars, including the Tin Man and the Scarecrow, were allowed to eat heartily. Judy, however, was told that even gaining 2 pounds could ruin her career. She was 16. What the public saw was a radiant star. What the studio saw was a commodity. As the 1940s rolled in, Judy Garland became MGM's top box office draw. She starred in one-hit musical after another. Meet Me in St. Louis, Easter Parade, Summer Stock. But with each production, the pressure intensified. The pills increased. Her moods darkened. She began showing signs of mental and physical exhaustion, often collapsing on set or disappearing for days. MGM responded not with compassion, but with contracts, doctors, and threats. Her personal life was no less turbulent. Judy married 5 times. Her first husband, composer David Rose, pressured her into having an abortion, a trauma she never fully recovered from. Her second marriage, to director Vincente Minnelli, produced her daughter Liza, but quickly unraveled. Infidelity, control, and the demands of fame turned love into resentment. The cracks were starting to show. By the early 1950s, Judy's reliability had deteriorated. Her weight fluctuated. She missed rehearsals. Productions went over budget. MGM, the same studio that had once groomed her like a prize mare, dropped her unceremoniously. She attempted suicide multiple times, one involving slashing her throat with broken glass in a hotel room. Still, she survived. And when she returned, she fought harder. In 1954, Judy made a bold comeback with A Star is Born, a performance so raw, so vulnerable, it remains one of her most critically acclaimed. She poured every wound, every heartbreak into the role. Critics hailed it as a masterpiece. But the Academy didn't give her the Oscar. She lost to Grace Kelly, and with that loss, some say, she lost the last bit of hope she had in Hollywood's fairness. As the years passed, Judy found herself constantly trying to reclaim what was lost: roles, respect, stability. But the industry moved on. Younger faces, newer voices. Garland, now considered difficult and damaged, was forced to take gigs in nightclubs and foreign tours to support herself and her children. Her voice, once a force of nature, became raspy. Her health, unstable. She was often broke, despite years of box office success. Poor financial management and exploitative contracts had left her in deep debt. By the late 1960s, she was performing in run-down venues, sometimes for as little as a few $100s a night. Yet she still sang, still captivated even if her timing was off, even if her hands trembled. The audiences weren't just watching a performance anymore, they were witnessing survival. She wasn't Dorothy anymore. She was a mother, a widow of her own youth, a woman being chewed up by the very dream she once embodied. When she moved to London in 1969, newly married to Mickey Dean's, a man 12 years her junior, with a murky background, it felt like her final act. She was broke, struggling, and publicly unraveling. Yet the headlines rarely showed concern. They mocked her slurred words, her late arrivals, her gone appearance. They called it a downfall. Few asked why she had to fall in the first place. Tea first. Judy Garland's ascent seemed unstoppable, a fairy tale written in Technicolor. With a voice that could melt any heart and a face that the camera adored, she became the ultimate symbol of optimism, even when her eyes betrayed a flicker of something darker. Behind the glittering career, Judy was constantly playing a role not just on screen, but in her own life. The beginning of her downfall wasn't one explosive moment, it was a slow erosion. In the 1940s, MGM was pumping out one musical after another, and Judy was their golden goose. But as the workload intensified, so did the abuse of prescription drugs. Her dependency was no secret on set. She would sometimes disappear into dressing rooms for hours, emerge with a painted smile, and deliver a performance that audiences would remember for a lifetime. Few knew she was being propped up with pills and pushed past the brink of exhaustion. The cracks began to widen. By 1947, Judy suffered a nervous breakdown. She was hospitalized, heavily sedated. She returned to work too soon, pressured by contracts and money she never fully saw, and by 1950, she was fired from MGM. Just like that, after 15 years of loyal service and millions in revenue, she was discarded. No ceremony, no exit tribute, just a quiet studio decision. She was uninsurable. That same year, Judy attempted suicide again. She slit her throat with a piece of glass in her Beverly Hills home. She survived barely, but the message was clear. Hollywood had taken everything and left her with nothing but memories. But even broken, Judy Garland never disappeared. She fought back with fire. In 1954, A Star is Born was her thunderous return. She poured every wound, every scar into the performance. Critics declared it her finest work. The industry, however, failed her once again. The Academy snubbed her, a loss that stung more than any review. Judy kept going: concert tours, variety shows, even a short-lived TV series. But the effort took its toll. Her voice, once effortless, began to falter. Her timing slipped. Some nights she was brilliant, others erratic. Audiences weren't always kind. Neither were the tabloids. They reported on every stumble, every misnote, every cancellation. The girl who once stood for hope now served as late-night punchlines. And behind all of this, there were the marriages. 5 husbands, each leaving a different wound. David Rose, who crushed her dreams of motherhood. Vincente Minnelli, who offered glamour but very little stability. Sid Luft, who fathered 2 of her children and tried to manage her career, sometimes protectively, sometimes opportunistically. Mark Herron, a rumored homosexual whose marriage to Judy was short and confusing. And finally, Mickey Deans, the nightclub manager who became her last husband, her final attempt at something resembling love. But even that union was marred by rumors of manipulation and opportunism. As the 1960s ended, Judy Garland was a woman displaced. The world had changed. Musicals were fading. Her brand of sentimentality seemed out of touch. She was no longer a star. She was a relic of a time people wanted to forget. Her concerts became erratic. She would sometimes sing 2 songs and walk off stage. Sometimes she was drunk, sometimes just fragile. In Copenhagen, in Hong Kong, in New York, there were as many boos as there were cheers. One night, she performed barefoot in a London nightclub. Her dress torn, her makeup smeared. The crowd silent. Some cried. Others walked out. And Judy? She just sang. Even as everything collapsed, she kept singing. In 1969, her final days in London felt like exile. She was renting a small apartment, really, just a flat above a bookstore. She was still doing the odd concert, though she could barely hit the high notes anymore. She was frail, down to 90 pounds. But she smiled through it all, told interviewers she had never been happier. A lie so well rehearsed, it sounded almost sincere. Then, on June 22, 1969, Mickey Deans found her body slumped on the bathroom floor. She was 47. The official cause of death, an accidental overdose of barbiturates. But what really killed Judy Garland? Was it the pills, the fame, or the years of emotional abuse, both personal and systemic? Hollywood called her a legend, but they forgot how they broke her, that it wasn't just an overdose. It was a slow, silent execution, decades in the making. By the time Judy Garland's death was reported on June 22, 1969, the headlines were almost sanitized. Tragic end to a troubled star. Fame takes another. The articles spoke of pills and heart strain, but very few mentioned what really led to that bathroom floor. Judy Garland had become the embodiment of exploitation in the entertainment industry, a child prodigy, fed amphetamines by studio doctors, a teenager denied food and love, a woman ridiculed for the weight she gained from starvation and the instability that came from being chemically broken. Her identity was fractured by a system that loved her image and destroyed her personhood. One of her close confidants later confessed that Judy was terrified of being alone. She feared silence. She once said, "If I'm not on stage, I don't know who I am." That need for validation, born out of a loveless childhood and a monstrous industry, made her the perfect victim for those who saw her only as a means to an end. MGM executives admitted decades later to giving her pep pills to control her performance schedules. Louis B., mayor head of the studio, was known to call her his little hunchback behind closed doors. She was touched inappropriately, manipulated financially, and kept under constant surveillance. Her mother, Ethel Gum, was no savior either. Judy often described her as the real wicked witch, someone who willingly handed her daughter over to the wolves. In interviews toward the end of her life, Judy often smiled when asked about her past, but occasionally the mask would slip. In a now infamous 1967 interview, when a host asked her how it felt to be a living legend, she paused, looked down, and muttered, "It's lonely." Just 2 words, yet they said everything. She was addicted, yes, but to more than drugs. She was addicted to applause, to affection, to the idea of being wanted. And when Hollywood no longer wanted her, she tried to find that warmth in husbands, audiences, even strangers. There were rumors that she had been begging for food toward the end, that she pawned jewelry to pay hotel bills, that she couldn't afford a proper burial, and her body was left waiting until fans and friends raised money for her interment. After her death, public reaction was complex. Thousands came to see her casket in New York. The line stretched for blocks. Strangers wept. Old fans brought flowers. Liza Minnelli, just 23 at the time, tried to remain composed. She was finally at peace, she said. But behind the scenes, her mother's debts and legal battles were just beginning. Hollywood reacted with tributes and memorials. But there was no real reckoning. No studio executive apologized. No one questioned the system that allowed a teenage girl to be drugged and broken for the sake of profit. The most haunting detail came from Mickey Deans, her final husband. He claimed that the night before her death, she had laughed at a joke, talked about starting over, maybe recording again. She seemed happy, he said. It didn't feel like the end. But that's the cruelty of long-term abuse. Even happiness feels like performance. Judy Garland had been pretending her whole life. Pretending to be well. Pretending to be loved. Pretending to be in control. And in the end, even her death was misunderstood. The tabloids ran with sensational headlines. Rumors of suicide. Wild speculation. No one really asked. Why was she in that dingy apartment? Why had a woman who made millions been left penniless? Why was one of the greatest voices of the 20th century singing in small clubs for cash? The answers were all there. They just weren't convenient. Judy Garland was a victim not of one overdose, not of one man, but of an industry that thrives on brilliance and punishes fragility. Her legacy, now whitewashed and romanticized, often skips these truths. But those who knew her remember the tremble in her voice during her last songs, the sadness in her eyes behind the spotlight, the woman behind Dorothy who never really made it home. At Hollywood Classic, we don't believe Judy Garland simply died in 1969. We believe she was taken piece by piece, over decades, by a system that loved her voice more than her soul, her image more than her truth. She wasn't just a casualty of addiction or mental illness. She was a casualty of an industry that has always demanded perfection, while quietly tolerating, even facilitating its cost. When we look at Judy's story, we don't see a faded star. We see a mirror, a warning, a child pushed into fame before she could form her own identity. A young woman who was never taught how to love herself because she was too busy being remade for others. A mother who gave everything, even when she had nothing left to give. Judy Garland didn't need to be saved by a prince. She needed to be protected by the adults around her, by her studio, her management, her family, her country, and she wasn't. It's easy to call her tragic, but that word is too soft. Tragedy implies fate. Judy's end wasn't fate. It was design. It was the inevitable conclusion of a system that takes everything from those it anoints as stars until there is nothing left but the light they leave behind. Yet we also see in Judy something else: resilience. Despite being drugged, belittled, overworked, and abandoned, she kept coming back. She sang through heartbreak. She laughed through lawsuits. She fought through addiction. When they slammed doors in her face, she found back entrances. When they called her washed up, she gave them stars born. When they left her alone, she walked out onto stages trembling, maybe, but still standing. We wonder how different her story might have been if she'd been born 50 years later in a world more aware of mental health, more open about trauma, less brutal to women in the spotlight. But even now, even in this supposedly more woke age, we see echoes of Judy Garland's treatment in today's industry. The tabloids still feast on public breakdowns. Studios still drop stars when they become inconvenient. Fans still love icons but forget the people beneath. And so we ask you, our audience, what did Judy Garland mean to you? Was she Dorothy the wide-eyed dreamer who longed for home? Was she Esther Blodgett, the fallen star fighting to reclaim her light? Or was she something more complex? A woman who knew too much pain, loved too fiercely, and gave too much because that's what the world demanded of her. We invite you to remember not just her films, but her humanity. Not just her songs, but her silence. And we ask, how many more Judas must there be before we change? How many more stars must burn out alone in motel bathrooms while the world rewatches their golden days on screen? Some stories were never meant to be known. But now, you know that behind the Technicolor wonder of The Wizard of Oz, a teenage girl cried herself to sleep, drugged and controlled. You know that the legendary voice that soared through concert halls once whispered in despair behind locked doors. You know that Judy Garland, who gave the world magic, was denied peace in her own life. And yet, she endures. Decades after her death, her songs still play. Her films still mesmerize. Her face, forever luminous, flickers across screens like a ghost who refuses to be forgotten. For millions, she will always be Dorothy, always singing somewhere over the rainbow, always that symbol of yearning, of hope. But for those who dare look deeper, Judy Garland is something more haunting, a symbol of what happens when brilliance meets exploitation. She walks so many miles in search of home, not just a place, but a feeling. Safety, belonging, love. Maybe she never found it on Earth. But perhaps now, wherever she has finally laid down that weight. No cameras, no pills, no applause, just rest. There's a moment in A Star is Born, near the end, where her character looks out and says, "I'm Mrs. Norman Maine." It's meant to be triumphant. But Judy's eyes in that scene, they're tired. They've seen too much. They're not acting. That's what Judy left us, not just performances, but pieces of herself. Tiny, bruised, breathtaking pieces. Her legacy isn't just in the songs she sang. It's in the conversations she's still starting about fame, about mental health, about what we owe the people we put on pedestals. The rainbow she sang about, maybe it was never real. Maybe it was always a metaphor for something unreachable. But Judy reached for it anyway. And that's why we remember her. Not because she made it, but because she kept trying,